everybody?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. Good afternoon to everybody. Yes, I'm going to be talking about a relatively new product that has emerged from research over the last 5 years, which is around digital technologies and how we can augment, in particular, creative work in the newsroom. As you could probably tell from the introduction, creativity and digital technologies are two topics that fascinate me. So a relatively simple structure. I'm going to talk about JECT and some of its features. I'm then going to demonstrate and describe what we consider to be an overriding principle of the design of JECT, and indeed other technologies that we built to support creative thinking and professional work, and that is augmenting as well as automating. The automating on its own is insufficient. Since I'm now talking to a relatively Norway-focused audience, I thought I'd sort of go back a few years and give a summary of an evaluation that took place of an earlier version of JECT.AI in 3 Norwegian newsrooms, and then finish off with some short words about the future. So what is JECT.AI? It is a product that's designed to give people in newsrooms, primarily journalists, but also editors, a degree of creative intelligence that they wouldn't otherwise have to enhance their creative ability, primarily to discover new angles and new voices for stories. So new angles are particular takes on a story that are unique within the field that they're writing about, and new voices, people to interview, people to get quotes from, people to double check the validity of the stories. The research itself has been reasonably well published. We even made it onto the front cover of Communications of the ACM last summer. So if you want to read more about the architecture and so on, it's all in there. I'm not going to focus too much on the specifics of the technologies. Suffice to say that we are a pragmatic integration of different kinds of natural language parsing and translation technologies, different entity extraction algorithms, automated sense making from textual strings, new forms of creative search algorithm, and some algorithms that go about auto content generation from the journalists. What underpins a lot of the power of these algorithms and the way we've integrated them is what we call the Creative News Index. So essentially our engine is running 24/7, reading, automatically reading and parsing stories, about 15,000 stories a day from over 400 titles written in 6 languages. So it's meant that even as we've tended to filter and remove some of the paywall titles that have emerged over the last 4 years, we've still got an index of semantic tags of over 20 million news stories, which represent a wide range of core news topics. And that gives us quite a lot of power in the tool. Having said that, that's our generic version. We also have the ability to apply this technology to our clients' news archives, and that is what we did in Norway a few years ago with 3 regional newspapers, where we built a similar archive of 62,000 Norwegian language stories, which I'll come back to a little bit later. One principle that we've worked through from the very start, given our background, is co-designing with journalists. So we try to involve journalists throughout the design process, not just to sort of say yes or nay to features, but to engage them and use their own insights and knowledge of their work in the design of the product. And hopefully you can see at least some of that in the design. But I suppose if I was to sort of step back, and that's really what I've done with this talk, is to say if there's an overriding principle behind this work, it's about augmenting as well as automating. We learned quite early on that going in and talking to journalists about automating their work tends not to go down very well with professionals who care about their métier. So we've looked to augment. Yes, we automate, but it's primarily about going beyond what mere automation can do. So about augmenting, in this sense, their creative intelligence. Just to give you a sense of how the product gets delivered in newsrooms, there is a web application version of it. This is a current version that's out there. If you were to sign up, essentially gives you information about topics and angles and people to talk to and stories that might be relevant for you to discover new horizons and angles in these kinds of information cards. However, the early co-design work really led us to realize that journalists were likely to be more responsive to something that wasn't yet another app that was cluttering up their desktop. Therefore, we also designed JECT.AI to run as a plugin to a range of text editor tools. So here you can see simply switching the creative intelligence on or off using this Google Docs sidebar. A similar sidebar exists in WordPress, it exists in Adobe InCopy, and it's also being developed, you can see here on the right, for content management systems that are out there in use in news organizations. And we have a particular partnership with SteboDX in Denmark and their Q content management system. And you can see a fraction of the sort of slightly gray interface of JECT.AI there on the right. And because A, we started as a European project, and B, we've been working with lots of news organizations across the EU, the product currently runs in English as well as German, French, Dutch, Greek, and Nynorsk. I'm saying Nynorsk rather than Norwegian because I learned the hard way that there are actually two versions of the Norwegian language. So there is this version that runs in Nynorsk that I will return to later. So that gives you a flavor of how the product gets developed. So let me get now, I think, to the main focus of my presentation, which is to talk about, when working with journalists, the need to augment their creative intelligence, their abilities, as well as automate. So what do I mean by that? Well, let me just give you 5 examples of this to try and demonstrate the concepts that I'm talking about. So let's imagine, as a journalist, if I'm working in a traditional way using established tools, search tools such as Google and so on in a newsroom, I'm required to discover new angles for a story. What might I do? Well, I might use, if I'm writing about COVAX vaccines, I might use different kinds of Google searches. I may use Google News search as well to see what I can find out there. I may drill down on certain websites, such as what the UNICEF website is saying about COVAX deliveries. I may go into particular news stories, or indeed I may contact people that I know. Obviously, this is quite a laborious process. It requires me to develop certain skills about how to use search engines and so on. If we contrast this with what JECT.AI does, and we're looking just at one of its cards here, the landing card, you can see here is a short video of the user, the journalist, moving his or her cursor around over possible angles that the tool is suggesting. So it's suggesting topic here such as inoculation, and not only inoculation, but it's also suggesting particular angles, such as here messenger RNA. So it says think about the alternatives to messenger RNA. Going down here, herd immunity, what is essential about herd immunity. And then what I thought was quite poignant last week when I created this video, it also drills down and suggests angles around New Delhi, which is pertinent given the crisis that's happening in India. So it's extracting, it's pulling out angles from all of this news content that's out there. So it's doing a degree of automation. And through the suggested angles that it's throwing up through these kinds of heuristics, it's also presenting additional directions that the journalist can take. So what is interesting here is, I think, as well as automating that kind of search process on the left-hand side, we are filtering the relevant news content. We're helping the journalist work through what's out there and presenting them in these relatively concise cards. But we're also offering additional expertise, these heuristics that were developed through workshops with journalists about what angles they think are relevant to different types of entity. Likewise, if I then was interested in following up a particular angle on a story, so again, you've got the same card here, and then I run it, I might then click on the immune system here. I'm actually now double clicking on that entity, and the product will then sort of give you links between, in this case, immunity and COVAX vaccine. So I can very quickly find and discover stories that are published here in, I think that was in Guyana, I think this one is in Ghana, enabling me to understand where the topic I'm interested in and the topics that I was originally searching on were related. So I can understand the nature of those relationships through the stories. I can also use those heuristics that I talked about a minute ago to drill down here in order to sort of undertake advanced Google searches. So by clicking on one of these entities, I can open up a whole space. In some sense here, I'm automating a little bit of what the journalist might do otherwise, but in this sense, I'm also giving direction to the journalist. We're giving them direction in which way to search rather than open-ended Google searches. If we look at, I'm interested in discovering new voices for stories. Let's say I'm trying to find a scientist or an experienced journalist who's already writing about COVAX vaccines. Then again, if I was doing this in a traditional way, I might look on Google Scholar and do some searching for stories there, articles that have been published on the topic. I may then drill down into some of these stories and learn more about the authors, the scientists who might have undertaken the work. And I may then go on to university department websites where these scientists might be. And again, if you contrast that with the intelligence card that we have here on the right from JECT.AI, the tool is pulling out on the top half here. It's suggesting journalists that I might talk to and why you might want to talk to them. It's showing the stories that they've written and why they might be relevant. But at the bottom, you can see there are also names of scientists. So the tool is also suggesting scientists who have published according to papers in Google Scholar and so on, and they can suggest people to talk to. So again, in this case, we're filtering the voices that you could talk to and giving them concise descriptions of the names. And if I was to double click on any of these entities, it would either take me to their Google Scholar page, or it would take me to their muckrag link page if they were journalists. And in terms of wanting to augment as well as automate, what it's hard for me to show you, but you can hopefully see it in some of the results, is in response to some of the co-design work we undertook with some journalists, particularly science journalists, both the gender and ethnicity of the names that's presented here is balanced by gender and ethnicity. So in the background, we're doing an analysis, not to give you the top 20 or 24 names that come up, but to give you a balanced set of names that appear to be male names and female names, and a balance of people who come from European, North America backgrounds and the rest of the world. We have the ability to refine that. So again, it's about augmenting that capability by helping people reach outside of the typical filter bubbles and the same scientists that appear on the news channels every night. Again, if I'm then wanting to sort of discover angles on individual published stories, so let's say there's an interesting story that I can see that's been published, I may go into that story. I might then have to do sort of keyword searches to find out where terms such as vaccine appear within individual stories. If I go across to what JECT enables me to do, then it can give me a story, a simple story in The Economist about what is COVAX, and it will again enable me to pull out those entities, to extract and summarize those entities. Again, it can give me these heuristics of creative guidance about where the angles might be. And again, there's some other features in the back of the cards. If I don't like those entities, it can come up with other entities that are possible topics and angles for the story. I can refresh this multiple times, depending on how many the tool has managed to discover in the background. And even I can do simple word clouds to give the journalist a quick overview of the stories. Again, that was in response to co-design work with journalists early on. So here you could argue that with these cards, we're trying to summarize stories very quickly by giving typically the top 10 or 12 topics that emerge in the story. And on top of that, we're overlaying this heuristic advice. Then my last example is more focused on science journalism and is around what we call the Quest. We have a European funded project called Quest, which is extending JECT's AI capabilities with guidance for science journalism. We've developed additional features such as audience personas and communication metaphors that you can see here. So on the left-hand side, you can see that we have a particular persona who is typical of a certain characteristic of reader or consumer of science journalism, who you might call disengaged. Now, this is not me that's saying this person is disengaged. We're actually building on published research in science journalism to look at different clusters of disengaged audiences. And by providing these personas of disengaged audiences, it can help the science journalists focus more on the audiences that they need to write for, what kinds of television programs they watch, what kind of languages they read the news in, what are their reading levels. These are all actually quite important factors in deciding how to write and communicate science journalism. And as you might have seen in the pop-up, there are little additional guidances or guidelines that are available to guide the journalists. And at the moment, we have 10 of these personas that are in existence within the product. On the right-hand side, you can see a metaphor that is useful for talking about, in this case, vaccination evasion. It's called vax evasion, and it draws a parallel with tax evasion. And again, you can see there's a description of the metaphor here. And again, at the bottom, you'll notice that there are some interesting little pop-ups around themes. So the tool is then not only just presenting this metaphor to you, it's also suggesting ways in which you can enhance the use of the metaphor based on these themes that are extracted about it. So we undertook a pretty substantial review of science journalism related to vaccines, the climate crisis, and to AI in society. We identified 70. So within the tool, there are 70 such metaphors that can pop up. Not only that, we've also developed different quality indicators within our Quest project, which are really reflective cards that can guide a journalist writing about science, at least in part of their story, to think about the key qualities that experienced science journalists associate with good science journalism. So you would expect it to be factual and purposeful, but it also talks about the need to interact in a dialogue with the audience rather than just publish. And this notion of spellbinding, it needs, if you're going to reach somebody like Vipin, one of these disengaged audience personas, then it should actually have an emotionally engaging aspect and not just be a dry science story. So all of this has been built into the product. And I suppose if I step back from what we've tried to do to augment what the journalist capabilities are, as well as automate their work, then you could argue that we're doing various activities. We're filtering the news content and the voices for them to contact in meaningful ways. We're not restricting them because they can always go and look at the original sources, but we're filtering so as to try and at least guide, focus, and speed up the process. We're directing how they're able to search existing news by using directed search guidance and giving them subsets of the news to investigate rather than have to browse through large web pages of Google results. As you can see with the intelligence card, we're balancing the voices, the journalists and the scientists that they might want to, according to diversity, so both female and male, and people from different ethnic backgrounds. We're trying to summarize the news content from individual stories using these entities to give sort of overviews of what a particular story is about without having to read it. We are trying to offer additional what we call expert knowledge through the tool here, through these heuristics, having run many co-design workshops with journalists to identify about 100 patterns of what constitutes a creative angle. And the last two, I suppose, consequences of pursuing this principle are about how we can deliver existing research, in this case about science journalism, in bite-sized chunks, such as through the personas in a form that they can quickly exploit, and sharing good practices, such as this set of 70 metaphors, all of which were used previously in good science communication. So that's what we've set out to do with the product, and that's where we've got to at the moment. Now, some of you may be wondering, well, does any of this work? So I took a chance here just to go back to an evaluation that actually took place a couple of years ago in and around Bergen in the Norwegian language. And I thought I'd finished with these slides, but I thought this was an opportunity to roll them out again. So we are dealing with a slightly earlier version of the news product, and when we set that, it was actually called Inject when we did this evaluation. The evaluation took place in 3 regional newspapers in and around the Bergen area. For the evaluation, 4 journalists in each of the newspapers, so a total of 12, sought to use this earlier version of JECT for 2 months. And they were using a version of the tool that would work in the Norwegian Nynorsk language. They had access to all of these international English language stories, the majority of the 20 million stories that I talked about, but they also had access to this indexed archive of 62,000 local stories that were written in the Nynorsk language. So they could sort of look globally, but they could also look very locally at quite specific local stories about local people. And due to a sort of technical setup challenge, rather than us be able to install our Adobe InCopy sidebar, they ended up using the web version of the tool. So it was in a separate window. window. And we really explored one key research question, which was whether the journalists, when they used the tool, were able to publish articles that were more novel and valuable. But to do this, we set up with essentially a two-condition study. We looked at the articles, a subset of the articles that they wrote with JECT and articles they wrote 12 months before in the same period of the year without JECT, spread those across the 3 newspapers, then brought in 7 local experienced journalists and other experts in the region who knew about the news in the topic, and had them rate these stories according, on Likert scales, according to value and novelty. So we were asking these experts to basically look at each article that was written with and without JECT, and ask how valuable is it in terms of its value to readers, and how novel was it with respect to other stories that you knew out there. So what happened? Well, people did write stories using the tool. Here's just an example. In terms of the overall uptake, the product was used in all 3 newspapers across the 2 months, and 10 of the journalists, not all 12, 2 didn't, but 10 wrote a total of 72 published stories. There were probably other stories that didn't reach publication, but they wrote 72 published stories with JECT support. Without boring you too much with some of the statistics here, you can see that on the Likert scales, if we focus on the right-hand part first over here, you can see that actually the value of the stories written with and without JECT didn't really vary. There were, the stories that were written without JECT were quite valuable, but the stories written with JECT were also valuable, and perhaps there was a sort of influence of the editorial process there. But one conclusion we can draw is that at least using JECT didn't sort of detract from the value of the stories as they sought novelty and creativity. On the other side, we did get a significant effect, although it's not so visible from the median scores here, that using JECT did lead to an increase in the perceived novelty of the stories that were written by the journalists. Although you could argue raising that median from 2 to 3 could be going from a low base. But it says something about sort of the anticipated levels of creativity that might be expected in regional journalism. I'm not casting any aspersions here. This is just the data as it was revealed to us. In terms of different patterns of use, the journalists were interviewed regularly across the 12 weeks, and they identified ideas for sources and angles, both from their own local news archives, as well as from the sort of 20 million stories written in other languages. They identified them from articles that were retrieved, such as somebody identified an article about the Utoya 22 July incident and the film about it, and that led to interesting angles for a story he or she was writing. Others came up from the individual creativity sparks, these kind of pop-up heuristics I was showing you. And interestingly, sometimes it was quite hard for the journalist to define exactly where the idea came from, because the tool is presenting lots of ideas and content, but collectively somehow it was delivering sources of creative intelligence that ideas were just coming up for them to write articles. And we realized, as well as using the tool in order to come up with angles for the story as a whole, they were also using the tool to come up with for angles within parts of the story, such as about a paragraph, or for example here a new section. It could be a sidebar for an article. So it was being used at different levels of granularity, sort of more coarse-grained creative ideation and more fine-grained. If we looked at how it was used in the newsrooms, there was quite a lot of variation between the 3. One of the newsrooms contributed the majority of the articles, and it's interesting when we looked at that newsroom, the profile of the 4 journalists who took part, they were generally younger and they were much more open to technology. And they all wrote stories using the product. And interestingly, because we were introducing a new way of working, and we didn't have the remit for us as outsiders to go in and redesign the workflow within the newsroom, they started to self-organize. There was a clear champion who was facilitating and helping the others to use the product. And that contrasted quite severely with the uptake in the other 2 newsrooms, which were probably less diverse. And they also had a few non-newsroom roles, such as somebody also acted as a photographer in there. I think more significantly, there was a different newsroom culture in those two news organizations, with a profile for older journalists who tended to work in more traditional ways. And I think one of the lessons we took out of this, that these new kinds of technologies are unlikely to work for all of the journalists that we find in newsrooms. I'm not arguing there's a generational divide, but those who are more comfortable working with new ways of technological intervention seem to be more understanding and accepting of how the tool could change how they worked. Having said that, we were also interested in whether we could be more productive, and we did identify that the articles written with JECT tended to be longer in terms of the word count. However, and that was significant. However, the qualitative feedback was sometimes using the tool was a bit of a chore. I think there was issues of usability, certainly having to flick between their editors and the web application version we had. It felt that sometimes when they were being taken away from writing the articles directly, it wasn't as productive as it could be. So I think that was an interesting sort of implication for how integrated we need to make this product within the tool set. So let me rush through this quite quickly to try and give you time for questions and feedback and criticisms. Let me just try and pull these themes together. I think that with JECT.AI, it's a new breed of product where we focused less on sort of semantic reasoning with news and more trying to enhance the creative intelligence of individuals and teams within newsrooms. The studies that I've reported here and other results do suggest that we can enhance the creative thinking and the creativity of news outcomes in news organizations with this technology. It's early days, there are caveats, there are clearly threats to the validity, making broad assumptions, but the evidence is promising. In terms of this overriding principle of augmenting as well as automating, I think that working closely with journalists over the last certainly 18 months to evolve the product's features, such as the inclusion of the diversity balancing algorithm, has been very valuable and helping us to overcome some of the barriers that were identified during the earlier evaluation, which took place a couple of years ago in those Norwegian newsrooms, and has enabled us to continue to evolve these features through journalist inputs. Having said that, I still think there are traditional non-tech barriers to the uptake of this kinds of technology, enabling journalists. I didn't put training here, I put education, to give journalists some better understanding of how these technologies work and how they can work with them, so as to upskill their creative thinking abilities. Clearly, introducing these kinds of technologies changes the potential workflow in newsrooms. So it's not just a case of introducing the technology, it's a much wider socio-technical redesign taking place in newsrooms. And then the last point, which really relates to training, is something that we found not just in the study that I reported, but in many, many cases of the uptake of the tool, is around this notion of creative self-belief. This is a well-understood psychology concept in creativity research, where an individual, he or she, does not believe that their work and their skills are creative. And therefore they have both tacit and explicit resistance to thinking creatively. And I've seen this many times where it's quite clear the tool is generating what are potential creative angles. I'm sitting there in front of the screen with them, and yet they do not take them up because they do not think that is part of their work. So I think there's a sort of wider framework developing in our new centre at the moment about how we can enhance workplace creative self-belief to get people to think about their work being more creative every day, so as to exploit this new breed of technology. Next steps. Well, you saw the versions of the tool there. This is there's been a lot of redesign going on and a lot of code refactoring in the background. This is the new design of JECT.AI, which I'm sure hope you'll agree looks a bit cleaner and more professional. It's now completely revamped with a professional UI framework, and it's a lot faster. It's got more focused guidance. The core capabilities are the same. And we are literally starting the wider user testing of this version this morning. So if people are interested and want to reach out and talk more about this new version, then feel free. And last but not least, I think I've left about 10 minutes for questions, Andreas, because we want this to be interactive, don't we?